Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. And tonight I rise in Anti-Poverty Week to talk about women's wages in this country. And the gap between men and women's wages under the Abbott-Turnbull government is growing, and it's growing at alarming rates, and seemingly the Abbott government didn't do anything about it, and it appears that the new Minister for Employment and indeed the Minister for Women, Senator Cash, is not doing anything about it either. So it sits at 17.1% nationally. The gap between men and women's wages nationally is almost 20%. Almost 20%. But wait, in Western Australia, my home state, and interestingly the home state of the Minister for Employment and the Minister for Women, it is a whopping 26.1%. And what has this government done about that? You don't even hear it being mentioned. But what they are doing is continuing their attack on workers, on low-income earners and on those who rely on a benefit from the government. And those are predominantly women. We know that in our community it is women predominantly who work across the service sector, whether it's hospitality, whether it's retail, whether it's aged care, whether it's cleaning, whether it's disability service. That is a sector where women are clustered, and in Western Australia, 26.1% gap in those wages between men and women. And yesterday we had another Western Australian senator kind of imply that Vinnies were really interested in jobs, any jobs, and I think Senator Back, whilst he didn't wrongly quote Mr John Falzon, he certainly made an implication that Mr Falzon would think jobs were above all else. But I just want to put on the record a quote from Mr Falzon around penalty rates. And Mr Falzon said, on behalf of Vinnies, he is the CEO, "Penalty rates are an essential means of building fairness in our economy, keeping many of Australia's lowest paid workers, women, from falling into deeper poverty and should not be tampered with." He went on to say it is vital that Australia's penalty rate system be maintained as an essential buffer against poverty, relied on people who are battling to make ends meet. Those who rely on penalty rates meet their household expenditure are far more likely to be single parents, women in receipt of household incomes less than $30,000 and living in the edges of our cities or in regional Australia. You don't fix unemployment by penalising people in low-paid and insecure work." End quote. That is what Mr Falzon said. Dr Falzon said. And indeed, at Labor's Fair Work Task Force, where we heard from low-paid workers last week, we had St Vincent's appear before us, the West Australian branch of St Vincent's, and they also talked about how necessary penalty rates are, particularly across the service sector, and how they made up a significant portion of people's incomes. Today, again, in Western Australia, we see that single-parent families, usually headed by women, mostly headed by women, are really suffering in the private rental market, and if they remain in the private rental market, they will end up living below the poverty line. And indeed, after my penalty rate speech yesterday, I got an email from a woman who told me what a struggle she was having as a single parent, bringing up a son and trying to manage work and rent. And yet, with that national gap on women's wages at 17.1% and alarmingly in Western Australia at 26.1%, we hear nothing from the Turnbull government. And of course, some of that gap, that climb in the gap in wages in Western Australia, directly relates to the Court Liberal government's harsh industrial relations laws, where they allowed employers for the first time in Western Australia to go below the award rates and to abolish penalty rates. And that is exactly what employers did. It did not increase the unemployment rate. What it did do, though, was increase the gap between women and men's wages, and it is time the government came to grips with this and put a plan in place to address this absolutely disgraceful gap between men and women's wages. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President.
Thank you.